We're building a model of the macroeconomy as we seek to explain the business cycle. And we've begun with the relationship between the aggregate price level and the real gross domestic product. Now, you recall that the equilibrium equation in macroeconomics is that income equals spending. That is, everything that's produced in the economy has got to be purchased by someone in equilibrium. So the real gross domestic product in equilibrium is the sum of spending by all of the agents who buy things. That is, consumer spending, business spending, the spending of government, and spending by foreigners, that is, our net exports. So what we're going to do now is look at the aggregate demand curve, a curve that we drew to explain the relationship between the aggregate price level and the real gross domestic product, and understand the story behind it. This aggregate demand curve is drawn to show that when the aggregate price level rises, the equilibrium real gross domestic product shrinks. That is, as the price level rises, consumers, businesses, foreigners, and the government buy less stuff. A movement along the aggregate demand curve means a reduction in real gross domestic product as the aggregate price level rises. But what's the story behind this curve? Why is it that rising price levels lead to shrinking real gross domestic product? Let's look now at the three stories behind this particular curve to answer the question, why does the aggregate demand curve slope downwards? The first story concerns consumer spending. How does a rising price level influence consumer spending? Well, think about it. When price levels are rising, that means the prices of all goods and services are going up together, along with your paycheck. But there are some aspects of your wealth that are fixed in nominal terms. Your savings account, for instance, your savings balance doesn't rise along with inflation. It stays fixed. And therefore, your real wealth actually shrinks. A given amount of money deposited in the bank will buy less after all prices have gone up. Now, the shrinking real wealth causes households then to feel poorer, and when they feel poorer, they reduce their consumer spending. Now that consumers are buying less stuff, businesses don't want to make as much stuff. Otherwise, they'll be stranded with a lot of excess inventory. So a reduction in consumer spending leads to a reduction in factory output, and that means a shrinking real gross domestic product. So the first channel through which rising prices lead to a shrinking real gross domestic product is through the channel of real wealth and its effect on consumer spending. The second way in which rising price levels lead to shrinking real gross domestic product works through business spending. Investment spending is going to decrease whenever the price level rises. The story here is a little bit longer and involves a few more steps. When the price level goes up, everybody needs more cash and more money in their checking account to do their shopping because prices are higher. So what you see with the rising price level is an increase in demand for money. The increase in demand for money, however, is frustrated because the Fed hasn't increased the money supply. The rising price level increases the demand for money, but the supply of money is fixed. Therefore, the excess demand for money is resolved by a higher interest rate. The price of money goes up until people are content to hold the cash and checking balances that they have. Now, the rising interest rate has an effect on business spending. Businesses are not interested in doing as much purchase of capital goods whenever interest rates are high because finance charges are higher, and therefore investment spending falls. Now, businesses aren't buying as many capital goods, they're not building as many new factories, and they're not outfitting them with equipment. So because of the reduced demand for investment goods, businesses cut back their output of investment goods. And that means that real gross domestic product is going to shrink. So the second channel through which rising prices lead to shrinking real gross domestic product is the investment spending effect. Rising prices, increased demand for money, increasing interest rates, shrinking investment spending, and shrinking real gross domestic product. The third channel through which rising prices lead to shrinking real gross domestic product is through the effect on net exports. That is, when price levels rise, foreigners look at the price of goods and services in our economy and compare them with the prices of goods and services elsewhere. And they say, hey, it's no bargain to buy stuff from that economy anymore. Let's buy our goods from another country. So Our net exports shrink as foreigners seek bargains in other countries. Since our net exports are falling, since people from abroad are no longer buying our goods and services but buying them from somewhere else instead, then our factories here see that there's less demand and they reduce their output. And real gross domestic product then shrinks. So the third effect is through the effect on net exports. Rising prices deter foreigners from buying our products, and when net exports shrink, real gross domestic product falls also. So there are three effects, and all three of these effects are summarized in the aggregate demand curve. The aggregate demand curve shows the relationship between the aggregate price level in our economy and our real gross domestic product. When the aggregate price level rises, there are three consequences. Consumers see their real wealth shrinking and they buy less. Businesses, because of the increased demand for money, see interest rates rising and they buy less. And foreigners see that our prices are high relative to the prices in other countries and they buy less. With all three of these reductions in demand, we get a reduction in real gross domestic product in our economy. That's why the aggregate demand curve slopes downwards. Now, that leads us to one final question, and this is often a point of confusion. How is the aggregate demand curve related to a demand curve from microeconomics? Suppose here we've got a demand curve like we draw in the microeconomics course. Maybe it's the demand curve for onions. On the vertical axis we have the price of onions, and on the horizontal axis we have the quantity of onions demanded. Think about what this curve is telling us. When the price of onions rises, people are willing and able to buy fewer onions. Therefore, the quantity demanded of onions decreases. The demand curve in microeconomics is about two effects, the substitution effect and the income effect. The substitution effect says that when the price of onions rises, onions aren't as interesting anymore because their opportunity cost has gone up. So you buy carrots or radishes instead. The income effect says when the price of onions goes up, then your purchasing power is shrinking, the purchasing power of your income, and therefore you buy fewer onions and less of everything else as well. That's the microeconomic story. It's about opportunity cost and purchasing power. The macroeconomic story, on the other hand, is different. On the vertical axis, we don't have the price of any particular good. We've got the aggregate price level, the prices of all goods and services, including your income. On the horizontal axis, we have the output, the overall output and demand in the economy. So what this curve is telling us is that as the overall price level goes up, the price of everything going up, that demand, overall demand in the economy is shrinking. And the story has nothing to do with opportunity cost. It has to do more with the relationship between the price level and other nominal variables. When the price level goes up, your savings account has less purchasing power. You feel less wealthy, and consumers respond to that. When the price level goes up, you want more money, another nominal stock in the economy. And since there isn't any more, then interest rates rise and businesses respond to that. Also, you can compare the price level in our economy with the price level in other economies, and foreigners respond to that. The issue with the macroeconomic demand curve is that the relationship between the overall price level and the overall output in the economy is because price levels influence the real value of other nominal variables, like the money stock or like savings accounts and other measures of wealth. So don't confuse the microeconomic demand curve for onions with the macroeconomic demand curve that's talking about how the overall price level affects real gross domestic product. Now that we've got the aggregate demand curve drawn, and now that we understand what it means to move along it, we can talk about what shifts the aggregate demand curve. And this takes us one step closer to completing our model of the macroeconomy.